I'm going to open the session, which is International Perspective on Sustainable Food Systems. And I'd like to invite Dr. Lawrence Haddad, the Executive Director of Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. Taoiseach, thank you for your support to the agri-food system approach. It can generate and deliver improved nutrition, improved environmental outcomes, improved livelihood outcomes, resilience outcomes, and, as you've spoken so eloquently, climate outcomes. I haven't heard many heads of state talk as passionately and knowledgeably about this issue as you have, so my congratulations. Thank you. Colleagues, I'm going to talk to you today about giving you a bit of an international perspective, and I'm going to hit you with quite a few numbers and graphs. I apologize in advance for that. I hope they'll be interesting enough to capture your attention. I'm the head of a Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which is an international NGO that worries about how do we get people access to nutritious food without while still sustaining the environment and climate. And it's a difficult balance. But first, let me congratulate you all on the Food Vision 2030. I read it. I admire it. I admire the process that it generated. I admire the process that generated it. I think it's very important to bring all different stakeholders together so that when governments come and go, but stakeholders are there to keep things going, to keep a level of consistency across administrations. The things I really like about it and find unusual, it really connects the domestic and the international. I haven't seen that in any other country. And it connects everything from farm right through to plate, which is fantastic. And it also has really concrete actions under each of the goal areas. So really a big congratulations. Now we're facing a pretty awful situation right now. We've got COVID. We're still dealing with COVID. We have climate change as a steady, increasingly loud drumbeat in the background, generating all kinds of shocks and tremors and uncertainties. And of course, we have conflict, not just in Ukraine. Of course, that's having a massive impact on food prices and fertilizer prices and finance prices, as you all know. But there are conflicts in many other places as well that are also very important in those localities. What I'm showing you here is hunger numbers, global hunger numbers is the yellow. The blue numbers are Africa, the red numbers are Asia. And what you can see is a U-shape, which is really unfortunate. We see a sort of a general decline in the hunger numbers. These are millions of the numbers are millions. So you can see a decline through to about 2010 to 2015 period. But then climate change begins to really bite hard on the hunger numbers and pushes it up. And of course, COVID pushes the numbers up even further. And these numbers are before the impacts of the Ukraine crisis have been measured. So we're looking at a pretty bleak situation. Now, these shocks are turning back the clock on hunger, but there are many faces of malnutrition. It's not just hunger. The dark blue circle on the right is chronic hunger. That's the 767 million number you always see. But these are global numbers. There are other forms of malnutrition. There are people who have enough food to fill their bellies, but they don't eat the right kinds of food. So they don't have the right vitamins and minerals. That's the big blue circle. There are lots of people who are eating enough food, but the wrong kinds of food, or too much food, and that's making them overweight and obese on the left-hand side. And the smaller circles are the kids under the age of 5 who are really vulnerable. If we don't get their malnutrition or their nutrition right in the first 2 to 5 years of life, we are condemning them to a life of lower productivity and lower potential, because it's like concrete that is setting. Once it's set, it's pretty much fixed for the rest of one's life. And just to give you a sense of why it's difficult to turn the clock back for children, very young children, the weight of a baby's brain at birth is essentially the weight of one of these bottles of water. This is glass, so it's a bit heavier, but if that was a plastic bottle, that's how much a baby's brain would weigh. At 1 year of age, the brain weight has doubled at 1 year of age. And our brains, on average, weigh 3 bottles. So you can see the incredible development and growth of a baby's brain at a very early stage. And when you do MRIs of babies who are malnourished, you can see the holes in their brains. You can see the lack of density of gray matter, what we call gray matter infrastructure. You can see that. So the discussions around hunger are really important, but I'm worried that the very youngest kids are being excluded from this. And Ireland was one of the most important vocal proponents of what we call the first 1,000 days, getting malnutrition right for the very young kids. And I know you will continue to do that. And why is this important? There are 198 million of these kids with these damaged brains in 2000. And that number has been slowly going down to 149 million in 2019. And it was projected to go down even further by 2022. But because of COVID, and this is again before Ukraine, the ravages of Ukraine, the number has gone up. So we're really in a pretty bad situation. But this isn't about stuff that's happening over there. This is about stuff that's happening in every country. So these are the stats for Ireland. I had a look at the stats before I came. 5 of the top 10 risk factors for premature death and disability, which is essentially premature mortality and morbidity put together in one number called a disability-adjusted life years. You can look at what the risk factors are for this in Ireland, and these are the top 10 risk factors. And you can see 5 of them, the 5 I've highlighted, are related to what people eat. And this is the case pretty much in every country around the world. No country has a monopoly on this problem, and no country has a monopoly on the solution. So what is the solution? The solution is to improve the availability, food in the fields, food in the markets, of nutritious and safe food. We also have to make it affordable, so people, if it's there but people can't afford it, that's not very helpful for them. And we have to make it desirable, because very often nutritious and safe food is available and is affordable, but it's somehow seen as inferior foods. I was in Tanzania a few months ago, and I was walking around looking at all the green leafy vegetables that were everywhere, and I was saying, why aren't people eating this food? It's nutritious, it's available, it's affordable. It's goat's food, I was told. So this was food that the grandparents were eating 30, 40 years ago, but now the current generation think how can it compare to fried chicken in a bucket? It can't. So we have to somehow make these foods desirable. In addition, we've got to worry about the environment. This is some data. Sorry about the clunkiness of the slides, but the different colors represent different food groups. And this is greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see the elephant that's always in the room, animal-sourced foods tend to have higher greenhouse gas emissions. So the answer is kill the animal source food industry, right? No, that's not the right answer, because it's much more complicated than that. Different countries have different needs when it comes to animal source foods, and in addition, when you look at other dimensions of environment, climate's not the only dimension of environment that we care about. When you look at other dimensions of the environment, different foods are more important in terms of the environmental burden they generate than animal source foods. So it's a really complicated situation. Binary solutions are not the answer. Nuance is everything. Context is everything, and nuance is everything. Now, data is also really important. If you don't have data, how do you even know? How do we know that Food Vision 2030 is actually working? How do we know that? Well, you've got goals and actions, and you need targets. And for targets, you need data. You need to be able to measure the indicators. So we at GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, have worked with FAO and have worked with Harvard University and Johns Hopkins University and a bunch of others to develop something called the Food System Dashboard that will allow, it's one of the follow-ups of the UN Food System Summit, and it will allow countries to evaluate their food systems and the progress they're making across a range of dimensions. So here's a really scary and complex looking graphic. But this is for all countries in Europe. So every row in this picture is a country, and every column in this picture is an indicator. And we've picked 50 indicators, and they go across, you can see food supply, the food environment, nutrition, and the environment. And we've evaluated where a country is in terms of its neighbors and in terms of other benchmarks, and assigned a green, an orange, or a red to it. And so I've highlighted, I don't know if you probably can't see it, but I've highlighted Ireland there. And, Ireland has lots of green boxes, but it has a few red ones. And at least the data, and this is data that's available in the UN and the World Bank and OECD, this is available data. We've just pulled it in and benchmarked it. And you can see Ireland has some challenge areas, high consumption of ultra-processed foods, obesity, greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption from food, eutrophication, which is about the quality of the body of water, and low supply of pulses. Now, every country has challenge areas, and so this is why we need to measure what those areas are. If you don't measure them, you can't manage them. The actions, I think there are 4 key actions we need to undertake. First thing is, don't sacrifice the long term for the short term. We're in a crisis situation right now. Hunger numbers are going up, malnutrition numbers are going up, people are suffering terribly and dying. The temptation is to just do everything you can for the short run and forget about the medium and long run. That's a big mistake, because there are lots of win-wins. Here's one win-win that we haven't yet grasped the nettle on, but we can still. Because of the crisis of COVID, the number of people receiving cash transfers and food transfers, also known as social protection, has increased dramatically. It's sort of doubled from 500 million, more than doubled, from 500 million globally to 1.36 billion. But we haven't really used those interventions to develop the nutrition of very young children. We could, we know how to do it, but politically that decision has been ducked. So there's a really good example of dealing with the short term and dealing with the medium term as well. Second thing we have to do is support small and medium enterprises, whether they're farms, whether they're millers, whether they're processors, whether they're retailers, wholesalers, wet food markets, you name it. They're very important in many countries, most countries in Africa and many in Asia, and maybe even in some European countries. They are the backbone of the food system, of the local national food system. And yet they don't have large operating surpluses. They can't weather the storm as well as many other entities can. And so we need to give them support. What kind of support? We routinely do surveys of SMEs in Africa and Asia, because that's mostly where we work. And we ask them, and this is a very recent survey from August of this year, what are the main challenges you are facing? This is for 200 SMEs in Africa. The main challenge they're facing, apart from high input prices and volatile input prices, access to finance. So we are working on getting access to finance, getting the private sector involved in investing in SMEs that are producing nutritious food for domestic consumption in Africa. There's a $200 billion impact investing industry. We figure 18, and these are GIIN estimates, the Global Impact Investing Network Forum. 18 billion of that 200 billion goes to Africa. Only 5 billion goes to agri-food sector, and only about 200 million goes to nutritious food for domestic consumption. So a massive potential for private sector finance to get to farmers and SMEs. Third thing is diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. There is an incredible concentration in the food sector, and I think in a shock-prone world, shocks are the new normal. They're not going away. We're going to have these shocks for the next 20 years. That's because climate change is increasingly loudly banging the table, and everything on that table is jumping up and down all the time. Shocks are not going away. So we need to diversify the types of food grown. There are 7,000 species used for food throughout history, but only 103 plants contribute 90% of the world's calories. We need to bring out the more neglected, underutilized crops. Energy used by agriculture I was surprised to see this, it's increasing in its concentration. We need to get more green energy into agriculture. Biodiversity loss is negative on any indicator that you look at, and that cannot be sustainable. We must be able to find some solutions that are good for agriculture and biodiversity. Some of the principles of agroecology are helpful. Circularity, resilience, diversification. These are very important principles that I think need a greater look. And finally, diversification of diets. We're converging on a Western diet. The whole world is converging on a Western diet. As incomes go up, we can afford to buy healthier food, but we're also more susceptible to buying unhealthy food at the same time. It's one of these double-edged sword dilemmas, and it's really unfortunate. So we have to somehow figure out how to make local diets and national diets more attractive, and the Western diet less seemingly all-powerful. And kids' diets, kids under the age of 5, their diets are not diversifying at all. They are staying very static. UNICEF tells us only about 24% of kids globally, certainly in the middle and low-income countries, even get a minimum diet diversity. Think about that. 24% of kids get a minimum diet diversity. That's not sustainable. Final point, we need to support the country food system pathways. The Vision 2030, there's a little rider on that first slide I showed, which says something like world-leading or world-class plan. Usually I think of those kinds of statements as being a bit hyperbolic. In this case, I think it's justified because this is the best plan I've seen. But other countries have their plans, and they're pretty good, some of them. Some of them are, they need more development. But many of them are pretty good. And the main thing we can all do, all of us, is get behind those national pathways for transformation. It's going to be difficult. There's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be sequencing issues. There's going to be fights. But the thing about having a food system transformation pathway is you highlight the elephants in the room. And until you highlight the elephants in the room, you can't really deal with them. One of my favorite films is The Matrix. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's sort of 20 years old now. And there's a scene in it where the main proponent is offered the red pill or the blue pill. I hope I'm not losing too many of you with this reference. They're offered the red pill or the blue pill. The blue pill is to kind of carry on and pretend that everything's fine. Ultimately, it will end in tears. But for now, ignorance is bliss. The red pill is when you see the ugly reality of the now, but it equips you to do something about it. So I think we all need to take the red pill, and I think that's what this plan is doing. So my conclusions, things are getting worse, and they will get better, but they're going to get a bit worse before they get better. But many of the problems stem from the food systems, and the good news is many of the solutions are in the food systems. But to make those solutions jump to life, they'll all be context specific. But these 4 principles, I think, are very important. Don't sacrifice the long run for the short run. Support small and medium enterprises all throughout the food system. They're the backbone. Diversify everything. I'm an economist, and I was taught in the 80s. I was taught that optimization is everything. Markets work perfectly. Market actors are rational. Institutions are brilliant and wise. I think we know it's slightly different now. So we're really living in a second-best world. And in a second-best world, diversification is really, really important. And finally, we need to support the UN country food system pathways. This is an exemplar, but there are others, and we all need to get behind them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lawrence. I think we've all swallowed a very big red pill after your presentation. Before I let you go, I just have one question for you. I know you were very involved in the UN Food System Summit. Can you give us an idea of what we can expect in terms of follow-up in the time ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I'm often asked this question, actually, and my stock answer is, which I still believe, is that it's up to us to decide what the follow-up is. So, shameless self-promotion of my organization, we were kind of hanging around for a few months trying to figure out what is the formal follow-up. And then we just decided, well, we're just going to follow up ourselves. The 10 countries we work in, we're going to raise resources and we're going to support those 10 country pathways. So I think for me, there are 2 big things that came out of the summit. One is the mindset shift. that if I'm in agriculture, I also need to worry about diets. And if I work on diets, I need to worry about farmer livelihoods. And if I'm worried about environment, I need to worry about livelihoods as well. If there are 5 or 6 outcomes, you can't just focus on one and neglect the others because they're all connected. So that was a big mindset shift. But the second thing was these plans, these pathways. They are multi-stakeholder, there's a lot of buy-in to them, but unless we support them, whether it's the UN or the private sector or governments or organizations like mine, if we don't support them, we will be missing, I think, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So however you can support these pathways, do it.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks. So that was Lawrence Haddad. And as Lawrence touched on there about the importance of the multi-stakeholder approach, and that is really what today's event is about, acknowledging the multi-stakeholder approach to an important question like this. I'd also like to thank Tasos for joining us. He had to leave, unfortunately, but we really appreciate him joining us today. Before we go on to the next presentation, I'm just going to go through the Slido element of today. We will be using Slido throughout today's session. It will be capturing your questions to panelists, and also we'll be holding a number of polls. So I'm just going to explain how it works. If you go to your mobile device, you can either scan a QR code, which is up there. If you're like me, you won't be able to scan the QR code. So you could go to slido.com. We find that for your browser, Safari or Chrome work best for slido.com. The event code is #FoodVision2030. And then just to join, you hit the big green button. There will be 2 tabs on the devices. One tab is for Q&A, so if you have any questions at all for panelists, we will do our best to get through questions. Click the Q&A tab. Or for our polls, as I said, we're running a number of polls today, so click on the tab for polls. Now, we have a team who will be moderating all of the questions for the duration of the morning. So make sure when you're putting your question in, if it is addressed to one particular panelist, make sure you identify who the question is for. And you can either include your own name or you can remain anonymous, whichever you see fit. We don't have a roving mic. Time is very tight, so the only way you can put questions to the panelists is through Slido, and we will do our best, time dependent, on getting through them. And also, Slido is now open. So if you have any questions, any comments, Slido is now open, and I saw a lot of you scanning the QR code, so hopefully it has worked for you. Now I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker. Tassos Haniotis is recently retired Director, DG AGRI Strategy and Policy Analysis. Now, Tassos did want to be with us in person today, but unfortunately he couldn't, so he is joining us from Vienna via Zoom. And I see you there, Tassos, and I know you've been listening into this morning's proceedings so far.
Yes, I have been. Good morning.
Great.
Good morning, everybody.
So I'll hand over to you, Tassos.
Thank you very much. To be able to hand it to me, I would like to be able to see my slides as well in the full screen. Like Dr. Haddad, there you go. I am also an economist by training, and like him, I represent here clearly myself now, and my interest to continue actually in Vienna. I'm here on a land management project that is starting on the horizon. Now, I put the title on whether we're into a normal or abnormal in food security. If we can go to the next slide, please, and click 3 times the buttons, because I want to identify some areas of uncertainty that would characterize the supply side of what we were seeing, and would give also a different angle from some of the challenges that Dr. Haddad mentioned as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, and click if you want 3 times. So I put, there you go. So these are new areas of uncertainties. First of all, the outlook of agricultural and food markets. It's anybody's guess where we're going to land in terms of prices this year, next year, especially after the drought we had on top of the war, and also in the horizon out to 2030, which is the target that you have in the very the excellent strategy you have developed about the food vision. The second area that we also have a lot worries and uncertainties is the energy markets and their transition. We all see what is happening with energy prices. They are directly and indirectly linked to agriculture. The third area is the outlook of shifts in trade flows, potential and real, and for a country like Ireland, which is a major exporter of agricultural products, this is extremely important. If we go to the next slide, we see very much the reflection of the uncertainties right now. What you see in this slide, I see myself right now, unfortunately, not the slide, is actually the commodity price cycles. So with red, you see the evolution of the energy prices, with blue, metals and minerals. With green is the agricultural prices, and the dotted line and purple is fertilizers. And what we have done with the dots at the end is, because we don't have the full 2022 prices, I compared the first 9 months of this year with the 9 months of the previous year. What you see in the upper right corner is not an accident. This is, yes, the fertilizer prices this year more than doubled with respect to the past. So what we have is a situation that, if we go to the next slide, has certain, next one has clicked with certain similarities clearly with the previous commodity boom of 2008-10. The first similarity is we have high prices to movement of all the commodities and very high volatility. The second similarity is that energy costs are a big driver. Were a big driver back in 2008-10 and a big driver in 2022-10, and they're pulling fertilizer prices at record levels. And the third similarity is that we also have food security concerns about the affordability, because a high food costs globally, much greater issues right now than what we had 10, 12 years ago. And also issues of availability, especially with respect to Africa and some countries in the Middle East. If you go and click into the next part, then we see the significant differences between the two price booms. The macroeconomic factors differ significantly. We had the demand-driven debt crisis back 12 years ago. We have supply chain bottlenecks and inflation this time around, partly linked to COVID and the asymmetric exit from COVID, but also to a very significant reason linked to the impact of war, especially with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and although the message has created throughout from destruction of human life, infrastructure, and especially in certain agricultural markets, namely wheat, more than anything else. We also have natural gas prices that, unlike 2008, that were pulling actually energy costs lower because of the so-called shale revolution at this time. Natural gas prices right now are doing the opposite. They're pushing all energy prices even higher than what the case would have been. And finally, in 2008, we had very low levels of grain stocks. Here, even now, stocks are at a relatively comfortable level, but they become much less comfortable if you take out the Ukrainian stocks that are blocked and cannot be exported. And what we also have is the impact of the war and also the weather effect, especially this summer in Europe. We lost almost 20 million tons of wheat because of dry weather. And next, please, this brings the broader risks to agriculture. The first important thing to keep in mind is that there are exogenous factors that dominate the price surge, exogenous to agriculture. And that limits the options we have in the farm policy toolkit, whether it's the EU or toolkit or the global toolkit. The second is that it's obvious that we have the strategic need to differentiate our natural gas sourcing. And as a result of that, the EU energy prices are expected to be kept, at least in the short term, not in the medium term, at pretty high level, with direct and indirect implications for agriculture. And the third is that the green energy transition affects Energy sourcing affects metals and minerals and raises multiple geostrategic tensions because we import a lot of raw materials, whether it is for wind turbines, whether it is for solar energy, electric car batteries, or what have you. So if you want to see in one graph accumulated the challenges that we face today in terms of food security, if we go to the next slide, please, I picked up wheat. And what you have on the left here is, if you look at the 30 years period, 1990 to 2019, the last data I had available for everybody. If you look at the traditional old major wheat exporters, EU and the US, their combined surplus of wheat dropped by 7 million metric tons. So still both are major exporters, the EU now more than the US. China and India have increased their surplus, which was small, by 12 billion metric tons. You'd have minor changes in Brazil. If you look at Russia and Ukraine taken together, they have increased their surplus by 66 billion metric tons over a 30-year period. Australia, Canada, and Argentina have not basically moved. And if you go to the right side, which is Africa and the rest of Asia, their combined increase in their deficit is 62 million metric tons. So essentially, the role of Russia and Ukraine has been over this 30-year period to feed the increasing deficit of Africa and the rest of Asia. And that's exactly why the war and the impacts of the war have such a dramatic effect right now in the food security debate globally. And since we have this debate and the discussion between the so-called tensions between climate action and food security, it is important to try to look at both of them together and see what they bring. So the next slide is a slide that could be read if you look at the right upper right-hand side. Those that are in the upper right corner, Ukraine, Russia, and the EU, have actually managed to reduce their emissions and increase their surplus. This is in all cereals over this period, 1990 to 2017. Those that are in the bottom left, Africa, and to a lesser extent China, increase their emissions and reduce their surplus, increase their deficits, if you want. The ones on the upper left have managed to increase their surplus, but at the expense of climate action with increased emissions. And the next slide shows the same situation for the meat trade. Here, it's only the EU that has managed to increase production by reducing and surplus by reducing emissions. Asia, China, and Africa have increased their deficits and their emissions, and the rest have managed to increase their surpluses at the cost of climate action. I mean, what this shows is a pretty complex situation globally. That brings me to the last slide in terms of the messages I want to pass to you, because you have to recognize the tensions before you move at the synergy. So if we go to the first part, I think we have a very false dilemma in trying to pit food security against climate action. Food security is a global problem. There is no such thing in the EU we are food secure because we have a surplus. Because if some part of the world has a deficit, all agricultural markets are going to fill it. All people at all times should have physical and economic access to affordable, healthy food. So it is a global problem. And climate change is also a global problem. It's not enough to reduce emissions in one part of the world where other parts are not doing the same. So there are very significant trade-offs that need to be recognized. Yes, it's true. But there are also major synergies that remain unreported. We have a full spectrum of best practices that demonstrate that we can improve productivity, we can improve economic efficiency, and reduce our environmental footprint. It's just that we don't tend to communicate these positive best practice effects and generate this false dilemma. The next false dilemma, if you want, which is also expand the previous one if you click. Next one, please, is the pitting private goods against public vices. For some, everything that is private is bad and everything that is public is good. You need both. And what you need is the recognition of the fact that environmental problems are a textbook definition of failures in private markets to accurately reflect what is happening in the environment, but also failure of public policies, because we have achieved in public policies what we meant to do wouldn't be what we are today. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress, but progress is not enough compared to the challenges. We also have food chain bottlenecks that provide evidence of the competitive, sometimes and non-transparent market behavior that complicates the transmission of signals from what the consumers really want and are ready to pay all the way back to farmers. And finally, especially in the European Union, I don't think other parts of the world have that because they don't have the money to spend on foreign policy that we have had the luxury to do. Do we need to focus only on public goods or not? You cannot have public goods, environmental islands of good performance and ignore the rest of land. 100% of land have to improve, and you need to combine both public and private means and focus of the delivery of the private goods and the public good and what they can bring together. And the third emerging dilemma that I see is on whether local solutions can solve global problems. Let me be extremely clear from the beginning. Local solutions contribute enormously to addressing many inherent negative side effects of globalization at global level. What we learn in economics is that trade is beneficial to overall welfare, provided that there are mechanisms for winners compensate losers. We have some mechanisms. In the EU, we don't have at the global level. So what local solutions have done, and we have seen it very much in terms of in the times of COVID and in the times situations like now, they help realign trade flows and into strategic relationships, both in energy and food, and contribute towards the solution. But we should be very clear that while this is necessary, it's not a sufficient step. Because if we want to address global asymmetries on food availability, we have to do it at the global level. And I think this is a very important message that is necessary to keep in mind. That it's also necessary to pull together all the initiatives that we have right now in terms of the Food System Summit. And I will finish with another one that is sometimes misrepresented, the one on the sustainable productivity. And that's the last point that I have on bringing over 30 years of experience in the Commission as an economist. There has to be a very clear distinction between productivity and productivism. Productivism is the focus we have had over the years in looking only at the economic performance, including the footprint on the environment. Productivity does not mean that you have to increase your economic efficiency at the expense of the environment. It means that you have to look at ways that demonstrate that you can do both. It's an output-input ratio where we have plenty of evidence that it's possible to increase productivity and improve our environmental footprint. And that's what I think we need to clearly work towards. That's exactly the reason I'm not with you today and we're waiting in another workshop. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us this morning, Tassos. That was Tassos Haniotis, ladies and gentlemen.